Thank you, Norm. Thank you, everyone, for coming back. So these are kind of the five aspects that I try to highlight from the story of Peter and Cornelius. And as I said, they are found all over the place in the Hebrew Bible, in the stories of Joseph and Pharaoh and, Ruth and Boaz and so on. And that's one of the things that I'm so passionate about, but I will not, unfortunately, talk about a lot today. Is one of the things that I want to invite you to do, as if you are envisioning doing an intercultural church, is actually read the Bible together from and through the eyes of the migrants and host communities, and try that with, let's say, the story of Joseph as a start, or the story of Ruth. Enter the story from different perspectives. And I think the word of God in the Bible will, by the power of the Spirit and the witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ, will enrich us as we do this kind of encounter of, being centered around God. The need is mutual, conversion is mutual, fellowship is vital, and also healthy boundaries are necessary. That helps us to relate to each other in ways that are strengthening those relationships. So I want to talk about, and I want to, time myself. I want to make sure I stay close to the time. So what I want to do here, there are lots of things I might kind of like, stop at some point just to make sure we have enough time for questions, and some of those things, maybe a future session or future conversation with me or other people, you might find it helpful as well. So the first thing I want us to start think about is, okay, this is a great biblical vision. Thank you. Where do we go from here? And where do we go from here is something that is beyond my field, which is, let's find the tool, either as individuals present here, either a recent migrant community, or I use the word, historic Mennonite community, or a church. Maybe I should have asked about the language you're using at MCEC. Maybe in the Q&A later, I would love to hear about your language. So whether you've migrated to Canada like 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago, or First Nation communities, as we walk into this vision of an intercultural church, we need to be realistic about how do we live into it. And one of the first things that we have started to implement at AMBS about maybe 6 years ago is we're started to actually use a tool. So instead of just talking in the abstract, and instead of just leaving ourselves and people that we want to inspire with this vision to kind of like do whatever, we decided to use a tool. And maybe this some sort of puzzle here is helping us connect some of those dots, build those bridges of the islands that we're talking about earlier. And we use something called the IDI, or Intercultural Development Inventory. I discuss it in my book from a theological perspective. They don't actually discuss it from a theological perspective. This tool is done for businesses and for, like university setting. But I find it helpful, but I also find it, as a tool, any tool has its own limitations. But the reason it's helpful is it gives us some concrete ways to move along into these relationships, into these intercultural relationships, as we increase our intercultural competency. Some people talk about intercultural intelligence. Some people talk about, intercultural skills. So I see this work as, learning from the resources of social studies around us, critical theory, and so on, so that we, as human beings, who are called to live into God's vision and mission can actually find concrete ways to learn how to do this kind of work. So Mitchell Hammer talks about, intercultural competency as the capability to understand and adapt behavior to cultural difference and commonality. So you see here that tension of commonality, but also difference. And there is that layer of adaptability, of understanding and learning how to live into this other culture that is different from mine. And this IDI, or Intercultural Development Inventory, created an intercultural development continuum. And I will walk you through it kind of quickly, but this kind of language helps a lot in finding some common ground for a congregation that is seeking to become an intercultural community, or a denomination that is trying to foster this just diversity and decentralizing unity that I mentioned earlier. So this continuum, and notice here, it's a continuum. It's not right and wrong. It's not, oh, you're terrible at, relating to people who are different. It's about competency, and it's about a life journey, and it's about, learning from even making mistakes. This is where we need grace. This is where we realize that, we take difference seriously, but at the same time, we are willing to learn how to bridge those gaps. So the continuum is kind of like a journey, like something we continue to learn as we grow in encountering those who are different from us. And it begins in this kind of monocultural mindset with denial. In this time and age, and the experience of Mennonite Church in Eastern Canada, denial in their definition is about not knowing, that other cultures exist, or if we want to kind of redefine it, given the reality of where we are in the world now, it's about denying the deep part of the iceberg of the culture. Yes, I recognize that we are different. We dress differently, we eat differently, we talk differently. But have I thought about how we think about time? How we think about conflict and conflict resolution? How do we talk about respect? How do we talk about raising children? How do we talk about God's mission in the world? That's the deeper part of cultural difference, that we need to move from this denial, recognizing the deep cultural differences. And there happens something called polarization. And in polarization, it's an us versus them kind of way of thinking. Us versus them. And it could happen in two different ways. It could be us versus them. We are better than they are. Thank God I'm not part of that culture, because that culture is bad in this way. Or I wish we are like those people, because our culture is terrible. So it could be us versus them. We are better than you are, or you are better than us and we are terrible. And this kind of like us versus them happens sometimes based on power relations. There is the kind of colonial mindset that sometimes feeds people of color and people from the Southern Hemisphere that white culture is way better than our culture. I wish, to become white because this is associated with power. Or it comes from the dominant culture, white cultures who are full, like sometimes have prejudice against people as those are uncivilized, and, that was part of the colonial system, where our role is to go and civilize the uncivilized. So this us versus them can happen by the dominant culture or by the less dominant culture. But of course, the difference here is how people live in these power relationship and end up either oppressing or segregating against others because of those power relations. Some people recognize difference, but then they say, you know what? Let's just focus on what's common. And you hear it in words like, we are all humans. And this is the orientation of minimization. This is different from what I was saying earlier about finding the common unity, because it's not, the way I was defining it, is not at the expense of difference. In the continuum, there are people who, in their intercultural competency, feel like difference can make us afraid of each other. Difference might actually ruin the whole project. So let's not talk about it. Let's just brush it under the carpet. And in that case, what happens is we try to just find common words. Like, we're all humans. We all believe in Jesus. We all love the church. We all want to serve God. And we stop there because we're afraid to talk about, yes, we all love Jesus, but who is Jesus for me? Who is God? What is the Bible? How do I understand the Bible? How do I understand the work of the Spirit? What is the mission of the church? And these are not new questions, by the way. They happen every generation, even within the same culture. They happen with ecumenical and interreligious conversation, and so on. And what happens is we think that tolerance happens by rejecting difference. And that's not how we should think of difference. I think minimization is a helpful step in the sense that it helps us to kind of, when we walk into any relationship, we need to find what's common. I mean, like, imagine yourself walked into, you just met somebody. You're not just going to talk about, you know what, your culture understands respect in this way, while my culture understands respect in this way. Let's talk about that. You likely are not going to do that. You'll probably talk about, let's say soccer, the weather, ice hockey, maybe a particular kind of food. You'll try to find something else to talk about. And as the relationship goes deeper, then the question is, are we going to stop on these, surface things that bring us together, or are we going to talk about the real difference? And sometimes minimization happens by people from the dominant culture because they are actually not aware that they have a culture. They think that their culture is everybody's culture. And therefore they assume, yeah, of course, everybody agrees with me on this. They assume that this is a common ground. No, it's your understanding of that. And you need to understand how other people also think about it. Sometimes minimization happens by people from the less dominant culture in the sense of, let's say, well, okay, I immigrated to the US and I have assumed that the US is a white culture, although, of course, I'm just talking hypothetically. And I'm like, you know what? Let's just, get along to move along. I don't want to be talking about difference. These people just open their culture to me and open their, give me a better life. And I just immigrated, I could have had this kind of life in Egypt, but now I have this kind of life here in the US. So why would I bother to talk about difference? Because that might give them the wrong impression that I'm ungrateful. And therefore, let's not talk about it. Get along to move along. It happens by people from the less dominant culture, not because they are trying to be sneaky, but because their conscience have been shaped in a way that, the white culture is the generous culture that have given me this life, and therefore I should not be talking about difference because I will sound ungrateful and so on. I think minimization can be helpful at an early stage to help us get over that polarization, us versus them. But we should not stop there. We should start to talk about acceptance. We should start to talk about our differences, our deep differences. We should create a space to talk about those theological and cultural and intellectual and ideological differences as we walk into these relationships. So acceptance, if I were to connect it to our first session, is kind of like the multicultural setting. We understand deep difference. We accept differences. We don't judge differences. But how much am I learning from these differences? Not much. It's kind of those the island image that we talked about earlier. Then moving along the continuum, one realizes and that this person's understanding of who God is and what the church is about and their culture and their understanding of respect is actually helping me widen my worldview. And I'm learning from it and I'm adapting to it. And because this is a mutual relationship, they are also adapting to me. In the IDI, and I from my conversation with Merlin and Fanusi, there might be some further conversations about this kind of tool in the conference. Is in the IDI people, as I mentioned, they talk about it from a business perspective. So kind of like, going on a mission trip or a business trip. So yeah, you could do that in a week. But what we're talking about is not going to, let's say, Ethiopia, and then you learn how to live like people in Ethiopia, or going to China or going to Argentina and live how to, live like people in Argentina for a week, and then you go back to your kind of home culture. We're talking about something bigger in an intercultural church. In my understanding of the intercultural church, we're actually talking about real transformation. We're not talking about like just adapting like in a small period of time. We're talking about a lifelong journey in which we are being transformed together. So adaptation to me is also about integration, in which we are envisioning these new relationships together. But that happens by knowing who I am. And when I know who I am called to adapt. I am called to be transformed. I am called to be changed. I'm called to convert into this relationship with the other. And so is the other. The other is called to know who they are, to be transformed as a way of encountering me, and that's where the mutual relationship happens. And if according to my understanding, if this is truly integration and not assimilation or segregation, if this is truly an intercultural relationship, then we are envisioning together something new. Okay, on this continuum, there is something that is really important as we think about our relationships. So there will be things that all you could afford as an intercultural church. Some things, not everything, is to create that common ground, which is in minimization. Sometimes when the boat is shaken, when the island went through an earthquake, what you need to say is, what is the solid ground that holds us together now? Yes, that's close to minimization, but it's not really, because you're trying to kind of respond to an experience that have shaken the whole house. Sometimes you will say, okay, you know what? I have, and I'm going to be maybe transparent here. Some communities, because, the long journeys of how you have thought about sexuality or gender or the Bible, or how all of this relates to what it means to be a Christian in the 21st century. If I grew up in a context that did not raise these questions about gender in the same way like Western cultures have, we walk into the space of like, oh my gosh, this is shaking my whole understanding of my relationship with God and what the church is. So can we learn how to accept each other? And I'm not saying about doing injustice. I'm talking about doing justice by simply saying, you know what? I understand your journey as a church that has been here in the West for a longer period of time than me. And you say, okay, I understand that you, in your previous context, you did not talk about these questions in this way. And what the best we could do now is to accept each other. I'm not talking about jeopardizing justice. I'm talking about taking a step closer than polarizing, condemning each other, sending each other to you're infidel, or you're too liberal, or you're too backward. All of these kind of judgmental things that happen in polarization. That is to say That is to say, in an intercultural church, it's not all about adaptability in every single layer. That would have mean assimilation. It means that there will be parts where we find a common ground, parts where we accept each other, parts where we are adapting completely to that kind of new vision that we are envisioning together. And that's the richness that happens in the church that we call intercultural church. So I want to, depending on the time, I think I have about 15 minutes or 20 minutes. Norm, correct me if I counted wrong.
You're fine. 20
okay.
minutes is fine. Yeah.
So about 15 minutes. I will highlight a few things, but again, this is kind of like big topics, but I think it's unfortunately have not been tapped. Even, I've been in theological education for 10 years now. Theological education, the best that theological education has been doing is having students read readings and commentaries by people who are from different cultures. So this is all new if we are to take it seriously for the life of the church. So the first thing I want to talk about is pastoral care. In a kind of monocultural, traditional Western, or a recent migrant church, pastoral care is a huge part of what all of you are doing or receiving if you are not the pastor. But if you're a pastor or a leader or a minister or a chaplain, all of this that you are doing has to do a lot with how you're witnessing, how you are extending this pastoral hand to people who are trying to figure out what it means to be in this diverse context. So some scholars who talk about pastoral care, and some of this might sound familiar to, a church that has been here for 150 years, but it's significant for migrant churches. So if your congregation is predominantly white and you host a congregation of color, a migrant congregation, and you're trying to envision an intercultural church together, or if you are a migrant pastor and you are pastoring a migrant church, these are significant questions that, let's be honest, we have been doing pastoral care and we have been doing ministry and theological education in the church as if nothing is happening around us in the society. So one of the first questions that migrant communities ask themselves, and communities who are host communities need to learn how to address these questions also. Where am I? What have I lost? Because I am a plant, a tree that was taken from its soil and it's now located in a different soil. What have changed about me? What is different about this soil that I'm part of now? That my stump, my branches, my leaves, my fruit are affected in a different way. So where am I? I want to ask you that question. How much have created spaces in your congregations, whether migrant or multicultural or intercultural, to have people learn how to locate themselves? I know you've been doing great work in terms of locating yourselves in relationship to the land, in relation to the First Nations, which is marvelous work of justice. But also, what about the other side of that, that we are welcoming the migrants and the sojourners into a land that is not ours, and now people are wondering, how do I locate myself now? How do I relocate myself in this? Where am I? Let's consider space in pastoral care. The second question is, when am I? Which decade do I live in? You all kind of, are in the 21st century, in the second decade of the 2000s. But are we all in the same time? And it's not because there is like backward time and forward time. It's just there are different times, different experiences of time. As a migrant, sometimes I freeze memories about my home culture. And when I go back to Egypt, Egypt has changed. If you're, let's say, a monocultural context, you've been here for 150 years in your place, your generation that was in the church 50 years ago is different than the generation that you are serving now. So when am I? How has time changed these questions and who we are and our identities? What have we gained and what have we lost because of time? And the last question is a question of transcendence. From where and to where am I? That question of transcendence is, and all of these questions were developed by a practical theologian by the name Walton. And by his understanding of transcendence here is, what is my vocation in my life? What am I called to do? How do I care for my family? How do I spend my time? How do I understand my life? This kind of essential, existential question. And all of that is shaped and affected by how long I've been living in this context and what has been changed and transformed about my identity because of those changes, because of the loss and pain of migration and forced migration, because of, now that I need to think about our culture in a different way than what I've assumed about it, because I only lived in a monocultural setting, and now I need to learn how to adapt and change. So pastoral care is a significant conversation to have. Related to this pastoral care, and on a very basic and practical aspect about envisioning an intercultural church. And I'm reflecting on this as both a parent and as a theologian and as a reader of the Bible. As a parent, Carolyn, my wife, and I have two children. Callista is 13 and Julian is 9. Both of them were born in the US. I was born in Egypt. My wife was born in Egypt. I came to the US 15 years ago. My wife came about 25 years ago to the US. So I am first generation migrant. My wife is 1.5 generation migrant, if depending on how you count. Our children are second generation. We face this almost every day as parents when we are raising our children, both in catching what we are bringing to how we are raising them, because we are Egyptian Americans and they are American Egyptians, with kind of like interacting with, like my son is bilingual, speaking Spanish because of his immersion school. So all of these cultures that are just kind of like happening in our household. So every day we encounter situations asking ourselves, are we aware of what we are doing and why we're doing it? That's what means to understand culture. And we, explain to our kids. Sometimes when I respond to my daughter about something, and I catch myself, and I tell her, Callista, I responded to you in this way because in my Egyptian culture, this is how I understand that value. And it's not because I want to force it on you. It's because I want to talk with you about it. How your culture, your hybrid culture, and my culture are kind of like now meeting, and we're trying to envision this together. So I want to ask migrant pastors in our midst, have you created spaces for your first generation families to talk about these questions? Or are you serving your congregation as if they are still in Chile, or as if they are still in Japan, or as if they are still in Sudan? I have not studied all migrant congregations, but there are many migrant congregations that they continue to serve their communities as if they are still in their home culture. And remember that question about time. Yes, we need to honor these memories and to have them sing the beautiful songs that have shaped their faith. But are we helping them adjust to the context that they live in now? Are we helping them raise their kids in hybrid contexts? Can churches that have been here for a long time become a resource to these migrant churches, not just by singing their songs, but also by saying, yes, we struggled with this too. We know what that means, because we also struggle with how it means to raise our kids, even in this culture that we think we know, and let's talk about it. Maybe this is why our second generation and younger people are leaving the church, because the church is talking about something that is not what they're experiencing in their world. That reminds me of the story of Jacob, who in some ways adopted these hybrid children of Joseph. Joseph went to Egypt as a forced migrant. He was not even recognized by his brothers because of his Egyptian dress, because of his speaking the Egyptian language. But then when his family came, he, the story goes on, he exposes himself, and then he brings all of his family and so on. But the reality is that he is married to an Egyptian. And likely his kids were speaking multiple languages. And they are half-breed. They are not pure Hebrew or pure Egyptian. They are hybrid children, like many of your stories. And then Jacob brings them and blesses them. So can we all be like Jacob, who are embracing these hybrid identities, hybrid children of ours that are in the church, of first generation, second generation, third generation, even like people who worked as missionaries and come here even to the culture of their parents, and they are not familiar with it. So can we create a space in the church where we are able to actually kind of embrace these hard questions? Where am I? When am I? And where I'm from and where I'm going? What am I called to do? And what are the relationships between first generation and second generation? And here is a practical thing that I think can be done with envisioning an intercultural church. And I want to say it in a way that doesn't mean that I am giving up on a particular layer of the question. So imagine you are a historic Mennonite congregation, and you opened your congregation in your space or your sanctuary to a migrant community. And you're trying to walk this fine balance between, you want to honor the first generation migrant who they lost everything, or they lost many things about their home culture, and they're longing to be in a space where they speak their language because they are surrounded by English and French, and in some contexts Spanish, and they just want to speak their language. They just want to sing in Swahili because they are longing for the familiar, because everything is different around them. But that congregation realizes that their second generation is caught between English, French, and Swahili. And your congregation speaks French or English. And you have children, and they have children. You have young people, and they have young people. Could there be a vision of keeping English or French, keeping Swahili, but then envisioning a parallel church that lives fully into this intercultural church, because the linguistic barrier is not there? And again, brothers and sisters, I'm not giving up on kind of like, let's work with the older generation or first generation migrants. This is not where I'm going with it. If you're able to do that, amen. But if there could be also a vision to actually start to think about what is the future of our children together, I think that could be a concrete way of taking the conversation further as we think about intercultural churches in our communities. I want to talk about translation. And you're familiar with the story of the Tower of Babel and Pentecost. I believe that these stories create a continuum of moving from monolingual, monocultural context, where everyone is speaking the same language, to multicultural, multilingual, to intercultural and multilingual, where understanding happens. So the relationship between Babel and Pentecost have been interpreted in different ways. And I'm sure you're familiar with many of these interpretations. The first opinion, which was a very traditional one, advocated by Augustine, and then kind of shaped many of us and our understanding, is that building the tower was hubris. And God decided to punish humans for their pride by multiplicity of language. And therefore, multiplicity of language was kind of like a punishment. And the Pentecost is a reversal of that. We don't get that sense in the text itself. The text does not say, you have sinned, you're arrogant, and therefore God comes to punish them. That's our imposition on the text. So therefore, there was another opinion that says God interferes to oppose hegemony and empire. That is, the hegemony and speaking one language and being centered around one project was against God's will, who said, go multiply and be fruitful and fill the earth. They just wanted to be centralized. They just wanted to be monocultural. And God interfered to actually make them multicultural by giving them multi-languages. And the Pentecost is a continuation of that. My personal view is that, yes, there is no sense of punishment. God moves the people into this multicultural context. But what the text also says is that they were unable to understand each other. So there seems to be some sense of loss. Something was lost. That I think the Pentecost continues what was going on in Babel, but the Pentecost also solves a problem that came as a result of Babel. Therefore, brothers and sisters, everyone with us here, I think translation is such a significant gift of the Spirit for the church as an intercultural church. And that translation is not just about language, although language is significant because language is the medium of culture, and shapes culture as well. But what I'm referring to is how we fare in the world, how we think about the world. So the translation here is a translation of language, but also a translation of culture. So some cultures are leaning more towards individualistic culture, while others are more communal. How do we bridge those gaps? How do we kind of connect people who have been shaped by individualistic culture and those who have been shaped by a communal culture? Some cultures are about how I look when things go bad. It's about kind of like external relationships, shame, feeling ashamed in some ways. Others are more about the internal understanding of what went wrong and how this creates guilt. Some cultures are about equality and others are about hierarchy. And they don't think hierarchy is a bad thing. They think it's about honoring others. Some cultures are about direct and others are about indirect confrontation because they have a different understanding of respect. Some cultures are task-oriented, others are relationship-oriented. And that affects how they get the work done. Some cultures understand time as small units. I will see you tomorrow at 7:45. Other cultures are about, I will see you tomorrow in the evening. People understand reality as a compartmentalized, like things are separated. Other cultures understand reality as all things connected and tied to God together. Some cultures think in a linear way, and other cultures think as a spiral. Other cultures think as like the flower petal. They have a center and they keep going back to it in a different way. So you sit together in a meeting and you're wondering, like, where are you going with this? Because I grew up in a culture where, like, I'm imagining, sometimes I catch myself doing that with my students because I've been trained in the West, thinking in a linear way. Give me your thesis, give me your assumptions, and give me your conclusion. It's not that people don't think critically. They think critically, but they think critically differently because of their culture. And many meetings are not as productive because we are not aware of how we think critically. And if we are more transparent on how we think critically, how we set the agenda, how we want to accomplish our tasks, what are the priorities, I think we can be more productive as we do that. And the word productive here is also culturally loaded. What does productivity mean? And so on. Is it about finishing the tasks, or is it about also deepening the relationships, or maybe both, if we become mutually empowering one another? And it's not just about one side to adapt to the other, but it's about mutual adaptability with the recognition of power difference. And the last thing is about honor and respect and hierarchy in terms of either achievement or whether this is intrinsic based on, like some sort of a social organization and so on. I have a third, layer to talk about, but I want to also be sensitive to our time. I will say it in like 1 minute, which is about food. And I wanted to walk you through different biblical stories and how food played a significant role in fostering this intercultural community. In the story of Isaac and the Philistines, food as peace building. In the story of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, it's about generosity and hospitality, but also about this mutual giving and receiving. And also the story in, or the text in 1 Corinth chapter 11, 10 and 11, where Paul is dealing with the injustice that is happening around the Lord's Supper. And meals and the Lord's Supper expose the injustice and the inequality, but also the hope and healing that can happen when we eat together, when we practice sharing stories over meals as we seek to build an intercultural community. I will stop here and leave it to Norm to manage the questions.
Thank you, Safwat. Really appreciated your presentation. This has been a rich day already. There are a couple of questions coming into the chat. I would invite you to continue to put those there. I'm trying to scroll through the conversation and find some of the earlier questions. There was a question that Michelle Rizzoli asked that I wanted to start with. But please do feel free to continue to add your questions into the chat bar. We're going to take a considerable amount of time here. We'll probably take about 20 minutes to look at this. That will put us with our schedule over the noon hour time. And so if you do need to leave at that time, you're totally forgiven for leaving early. We do welcome you to stay as long as you can. There is a time of worship at the end of this where Annalie and Matthew will be leading us again in worship, and then Finosi will have some closing words at the end of that. But Michelle Rizzoli asked this question: what to do about the economic differences? The dominant culture values independence, but the immigrant church often has less resources. Mm-hmm. How can those resources be shared without perpetuating the power structures that come with helping?
Yes, this is a very important question. It invites a first layer of thinking about how, because when we think about culture, we usually think about racial layers and ethnic layers, and there are many other facets of identity that shape and are shaped by our culture, including the socioeconomic experiences, gender, sexual orientation, historical context, and varieties of layers of identity that they don't usually come to mind when we talk about an intercultural church. So I'm thankful to you asking this question, because I wanted to widen that kind of question. What are the many facets of identity that shape our culture? Because it's not just about ethnicity. So thank you for raising this question. And this question also invites me to say something that I know And it's not that it's because I want to understand the different sensitivities around it. But I will, because I understand the sensitivities, and I hope that we have a layer of trust where we could actually talk about this in courageous ways so that we can move forward. Because I think that's one of the values of an intercultural church. Is, let's be honest, that yes, there are socioeconomic differences.
Mhm.
So actually that recognition in itself at the beginning, and it's not just about historic, let's say, white churches as opposed to migrant churches, because there are many migrant churches who are well-to-do as well. Like they kind of move along in the economic environments of their migration contexts. So there are, and there are people who have been in the country for a long time and they are still struggling. You have in the American context, people who have been continuously oppressed by slavery, by segregation, by the Jim Crow laws and all of that. And in the Canadian context, you could think of other layers where people have been in the country for a long time and have been deprived of these resources for a long time. So let's talk about the economic layers in relation to identity through the lens of intersectionality. How the multi-layers of identity shape the relationships of power, without losing the notion that yes, white people have privilege in many contexts in Canada and in America. So one of the first things to acknowledge is that yes, we are called into a mutual relationship, but that mutuality can be expressed in different ways. And generosity and hospitality can be extended without creating a hegemony and without reproducing the colonial and the imperial structures. And this could happen by inviting and becoming aware and leaving the space and empowering people who do not have those privileges or have those needs to tell us how they want that help. So in some ways, we should not start with our own assumptions about their needs, but we should start with learning from them what their needs are and how they want us to meet those needs, because they do need them. Another way of living into this empowerment is also asking, let me know when I'm overstepping. Let me know when I am assuming things. And without becoming abusive because of my power, let me know when you are aware of what you can offer into this relationship, and when, and how, and in what process. Because it is about what we offer, but it's also about what we receive. It's about how we offer what we offer and how we receive what we receive. So it's not just about, the financial aid and the financial help, because let's be honest, if there is financial need and I have those resources, it's okay to help. But the question is, how are we doing it? How are we doing it in a way that, let's say, is sensitive to the culture of honor, to the culture of that, I don't want to be dependent in this way, that I'm also working hard, but it's the structural system that is not enabling me to get what you also get, just because of the history of the hierarchy and the socioeconomic systems that we are part of now.
Yes.
I hope that answers your question. If
yeah.
you have follow up, please feel free to add or push that.
There's so much we could unpack there. I know Francois Machichi also asked a question around economic integration and how do we work at that. There was a comment about whether we are independent or interdependent, and I think you've touched on those here already. Christina Edmondson writes a longer post here that just want to unpack a bit with you, and it focuses on the difference in leadership roles and how some of those are gender specific in different cultures, and how we interact when we define those roles differently. And so the way she asks the question is, what about difference in understandings of gender equality? I am asking this from the perspective of a female pastor. I find that sometimes challenging when relating to church leaders from other cultures where women are more rarely in leadership and in some cases not accepted. I find it a barrier to engagement when I'm trying to truly and vulnerably relate to someone who questions my calling because of my gender.
Yes.
So yeah, how would we work at something like that?
Thank you so much for this question. I want to start by acknowledging that as a male straight pastor myself, I have grown a lot in understanding how to relate to those questions, because I grew up in a culture where there is hierarchy, gender hierarchy, and also my culture doesn't talk about sexual orientation or gender roles, and so on. And one of the things that I want to be sensitive to female pastors, to pastors of whose sexual orientation is not heterosexual and have been marginalized for a long time in our churches and our communities. But also, as we do this kind of work of justice, of inclusion and justice for people who have been marginalized because of their sexual orientation and because of their gender, I want to also invite you to understand and appreciate where some of pastors or church members who come from different contexts, who have not walked that long walk of maybe 60 years of talking about gender roles, and depending on the congregation and the denomination, whether in the US and Canada, are still even talking about it. This is not just about white communities and communities of color. This is happening among white communities, and communities of color and communities of color. So it's not just about a unified kind of Western culture and a unified Southern Hemisphere culture where gender roles are kind of like figured out here and gender role are figured out here. We still, I'm going to use this broad generalized language, in Western cultures, there are many churches that does not ordain women and does not, perform gay marriage or support gay ordination and so on. So I want to kind of like expand a little bit. I'm not trying to kind of like muddy the water. I hope this is coming across. But to move a little bit from the dichotomy of why this is happening. Because there are people who have, people of color who are, inclusive and advocating, and there are white people who are not, and so on. The other aspect that I think we need to be starting to think about and reflect on is this: how do we walk this journey of helping the other understand my position in a way that honors their dignity and in a way that does not turn them into that defensive place? And that is a mutual relationship. And I say that with a huge hesitancy, if that is a word, hesitation, sorry, because I don't want to put the burden on those who have been marginalized and oppressed to do I want to help you understand why this is so, why I have a place. Although that layer or that question is also determined by what facet of identity am I talking about. And this is where the intersectionality is so significant. So someone might have been marginalized and excluded as a female leader because of her gender, but maybe because of her ethnicity or color or socioeconomic status, she has some privilege, and she has been included in the conversation in a way that maybe a pastor who might not be affirming or is not there in the same place about gender roles have experienced marginalization because of their color or because of their religion in the culture where they were. Mm-hmm. So can we find a space in which we stir empathy? Because if we start to see the place where I understand you have been marginalized in your context because of your socioeconomic status or because of a civil war in which, you know, a dominant culture fought against your people because this is your identity, this is who you are, and you felt the pain and suffering of exclusion. Can you start to see how I also experience being excluded because of my gender, because of my sexual orientation, because of who I am? Because sometimes it's how we define who we are, because our identity is multi-layered. And sometimes as a male migrant pastor, I was marginalized as a Christian. I was not marginalized because of my gender in Egypt. I was marginalized because of my faith. So if you come approach me because of my gender, I might not be able to hear my privilege and relinquish it, because that's not the place where I experience that vulnerability. And same thing if let's say as a migrant pastor, I'm trying to relate to someone and I'm just trying to say, you know, I am not there where you are, because I did not have this journey of understanding what gender is and gender roles, and help me, because I don't understand. Let's be honest, there is a lot of fear of making mistakes. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of fear because there is a history of oppression that is involved, and a history of marginalization, and we are afraid of either reproducing it or we're oblivious to it, and we have not had those spaces in which we are actually telling the stories. So someone just migrated 10 years ago, just walked into a church where gender roles are quite different, but they were not here in the past 40 years. So they don't know it. And yes, it is hard to kind of reproduce these stories, because let's be honest, they are painful ones. But I know I'm taking a long time here, because this is a really, really important question. And let's be honest about it. It raises a lot of congregations to leave denominations. It leaves some people frustrated because they are unable to talk with each other, and they are unable to worship, serve together, and so on. I faced this because I pastored an Egyptian church when I was finishing my doctorate. There is a real question that migrant churches are going to face when their children are raised in gender relations, but they go to school where they are educated otherwise. So absolutely. I am calling on to my brothers and sisters who are pastoring immigrant churches. Instead of trying to reproduce those gender roles and start to bump into your children, because there is a lot of conflict is going to happen. And instead of also bumping into your brother and sister who thinks about gender roles differently, they could be actually a resource for you to help you navigate with your children how they will encounter gender roles in a different way. But those who have been in Canada for a long time, and they have gone through this gender role question, you can be a resource. And please hold back your judgment about gender roles from a white feminist or a white LGBTQ community, because that is reproducing a colonial perspective about what gender roles are. or what feminism looks like. Actually, African Americans teach us that feminism differs so much from white feminism, and sometimes can happen through the form of motherhood and childbearing and caring for the family. For white feminists, this is not gender roles, this is injustice. But for African American women, no, this is agency, this is power, and this is resistance, because they are raising kids who are actually going to transform those realities of oppression and so on. So in some ways, as we walk into this space with a history of pain and suffering, we're confronted also with prejudice. We're confronted with how have we constructed these gender roles and essentialized them in set of practices that we are unable to see the agency and the power that exists in the other ways of how other people do it. And that doesn't mean that then oppressed cultures are all happy and dandy. Mm-hmm. That's what womanist scholars are telling us. Womanist scholars are saying Black theology and liberation theology is all about opposing white supremacy. Great, but there are Black men who oppress Black women. You see, all of those layers are at play here. And if we create the space in the church to eat together, to translate culture, when I walk into my class to teach a class that I've been teaching for 10 years, one of the first questions I ask myself as a teacher, what am I assuming? That because I have been in this conversation for 10 years, my students don't know and do not assume. And I think that is a very important starting point for this very, very important question that you have asked. And I apologize for the long answer, but it's such an important question. And I know it causes a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, and a lot of exclusion on both sides.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Safwat. That was critically important for you to unpack that. That was, as someone has said in the chat, a great answer. Thank you for that. I just want to reflect back one observation that I have as the mission minister for MCEC and working with all of our new Canadian or immigrant congregations, is that one of the greatest challenges, and you touched on this, one of the greatest challenges that they have is how do they relate to their children who are growing up in a very different cultural context than they came from the country of origin. And one of the harsh realities of this, if you look at the way in which church plants developed across the Canadian landscape, is that the rate of decline in our first generation or new Canadian churches is actually higher than in our established churches, because children are checking out once they reach the age of majority, because they no longer understand the culture of their parents or have in some way rejected that. So that's a really important space for us to navigate. And there was also a couple of comments in the chat which I want to recognize, just that the call to being intercultural isn't simply a conversation between cultures that are varied by ethnicity or country of origin, but it's a diversity that calls us to recognize that there are cultures within each of our congregations, that there are varying cultures even there, cultures that define themselves in different ways, and for us to be working at transformation in all of those aspects is a much broadens this conversation even further. So I want to point out one final question, and this is more of a practical question, and it's a question from Moses Falco, who says, any tips on practicing intercultural church during this pandemic? It's hard to share food over Zoom. I feel like people are also tired and often don't have the energy to do this kind of work. Status quo feels more comfortable. So what ideas would you share with us?
Yes, thank you for this question. It's also important because we are learning about, what it means to be at church at a distance. But, those are also moments like I don't want to say advantage, because there are lots of suffering happening because of the pandemic, is sometimes these times, and I'm not saying God made it, happen, of course, but when they happen and they make us pause, they make us ask, so what is central? What are we holding on to? What have we assumed as the normal that now, if we talk about a new normal, Are we reproducing the old normal in just a new face or disguise, or are we actually envisioning a new normal to respond to the new reality? So Moses, this is actually a moment for the church to pause and to say, what was the old normal that we have taken for granted, that doing church over Zoom made us think about and reflect on in a way that is, I hope, when we go back, we don't just reproduce the church that was pre-pandemic or prior to the pandemic. The other aspect is to recognize, we talked about socioeconomic layers. We need to talk about, do all people have access to the internet in the same way? Are all people suffering the pandemic in the same way and in the same layer? I'm privileged to be able to get my salary while I'm home taking care of my kids. That's not the story of everyone. There are people who have to work, and there are people who have to juggle work and kids and income limitations and all of that. People who have lost their jobs, people who have might be lose the rent and so on. So how are we thinking about those layers as we think about doing pastoral care and pastoral ministry? When we walk into the Zoom space, how are we greeting each other? How are we creating a conversation for people to actually, because those are cultural layers. We walk into this space and I was like, I want to greet everyone on my screen, and say hi and how are you and how's your life, how is work and so on. Sometimes because people are Zoom fatigued, they just want to get to the church, get to the worship and so on and get going. There are people who are embarrassed so much when technology doesn't work, because their culture is all about perfecting it, and you got to do everything in the right way. While you find people who are if you want to the prayer, someone who is supposed to pray and their internet broke, I'm happy to jump in and pray. But some cultures are like, no, you got to tell me a week in advance, because you don't just call me on the Zoom to pray. So what are these are just really simple things that we could, how we greet each other, how do we pivot in a Zoom meeting in the church? How are we maybe kind of shake our worship a little bit when we realize that our worship was all about the bulletin, and if someone deviates from the bulletin, that's anathema, kind of doing something wrong and insulting the Spirit, because he went out of the rigid kind of vision for the worship. What if we just walk into a Zoom meeting and maybe improvise? And would we go back with that to our sanctuary and be kind of scared for something maybe to go wrong, and maybe also something to emerge that is new, because the Spirit can also work as much as the Spirit work as we prepare the bulletin on Wednesday, the Spirit can also work on Sunday at 11 a.m. in a way that we did not anticipate, and without freaking out.
Amen. Amen to that. So just one last line from something that you said in your last presentation: real transformation is a lifelong journey of transformation. And this is a lifelong journey for us as MCEC to continue to be working at this transformation as well. So I want to thank you, Brother Safwat, for your presentations today. This was truly a blessing. This has been an encouragement to me, and I'm sure to many others. I want to thank everybody for welcoming us into your living rooms and into your homes today. This was a blessing to be on the screen together with all of you.